So here it's all about the future and how the future might look like, not only in terms of financial regulation, but also how digitalization, which is clearly very much pushed by the current corona crisis, will shape our society, will shape the way we are perhaps also doing business together. And we are going to hear from Ben Hammerslay. Some of you might know him as the writer and presenter of the Netflix and BBC TV series Cybercrimes, but he's much more than that. He's one of the first journalists really dedicated to digital issues, and he's an expert on all things digital and thinks a lot about how this is actually going to shape how we live, and as I said, how we do our business and how our daily lives will be affected. We pre-recorded his presentation, but Ben will be available for chat or for answers, and also obviously for question and answers after the presentation via the chat function in the interface you're using. So let's listen in of what he's having to say about how the pandemic change, or how the pandemia will change our world.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me. My name is Ben Hammersley, and to introduce myself, really, I have two jobs. I run a consultancy where we specialize in medium-term future scenarios and scenario planning. And I also have a startup where we're solving a particular problem in artificial intelligence. Now, just from that, never mind the rest of my biography, you might immediately understand that the majority of my work is technology-centric, that everything I do really is based around modern-day technology, the digital network, and the capabilities that those networks and that equipment gives us, plus all of the changes it's made to the world. And that ordinarily would be true. In the 10 years or so that I've been advising governments and large corporations and individuals around the world full-time, in those 10 years, the vast majority of changes, the vast majority of things that they wanted to know about have come about because of technology, and solely because, really, of technology. But this year has shown us that that isn't always very useful. It isn't, in fact, the best approach to thinking about or discussing the future. Now, I've been asked to talk to you about, the future of the workplace, the future of business, all of the future scenarios of the next few years in a post-COVID or peri and then post-COVID era. But to start off with, what I think is really important to point out is that it is not just about technology. It is about the interdependence of all of the things that go to make up society. Technology, business, culture, politics, biology, epidemiology, religion, human psychology, and all of the other things coming together into an interdependent co-arising of everything. Now, the reason I point this out is because ordinarily in a talk like this, ordinarily I would be sat in front of you or stood in front of you on a stage and we would be having a conversation, but ordinarily in a talk like this, when I've been asked to talk about the future, I will be telling you all about new developments coming down the line, new things that we can do, new technologies and associated changes which will go together to reshape our world going forward. I'm not going to do that this year. I don't think it's suitable. Instead, what I want to do is give you some ideas which will help you reframe your own predictions about the world. I want to talk about three things that will help you take your own personal context, or the context of your own company or your own organization, your own country, community, whatever, and from that come up with your own predictions and your own strategies. This is partly because of the interdependence of everything, which has been so obviously shown in the past year, but also because as a futurist, I've had a sort of an epiphany, really, which is that I could stand in front of you today, virtually or in real life, and I could talk about the future, and I could give you a prediction, and that prediction would be 100% correct for about 10 million people somewhere on the planet in the next few years. For the rest of the people in the world, however, it won't be correct at all. Now, of course, my job isn't to be completely right. In many ways, it's to be wrong, but in an interesting way. But I don't really want to go through that theatrical exercise. Instead, I'd like to give you some ideas around the shape that our futures will fit inside, even though all of our futures will all be different depending on where we are, temporarily, location-wise, and so on. So let's do that. There are 3 things I want to talk about. The first is called the Two Styles of Preparedness. The second one is called the Ontological Crisis. And the third is called the Great Reassessment. So let's start with the Two Styles of Preparedness. If you made a global review of the pandemic of the past 9 months, 10 months or so, you might, depending on where you're from, find some very possibly counterintuitive things. Some parts of the world that you would think would have been hit very hard weren't. And some parts of the world that you would have thought would be incredibly competent at dealing with such a thing, and so therefore would not be hit very hard, also weren't very competent and were hit hard. And I'd like to propose a theory of why this is. And within that theory, I think are some insights which will help you go forward with your own futures. I think there are 2 types of preparedness in general. There's what we call pre-planned stockpiling, and the second is called adaptive competence. Now, pre-planned stockpiling is where you get warehouses and you fill it full of stuff, and you have lots of supplies, and also you fill it full of plans. Red folders usually with all of your emergency plans, with every possible thing that could go wrong already written down and ready to go. And vast structures of people or positions or roles who are ready to leap into action when a particular plan is pulled off the shelf and put into action. This, it turns out, is not a very good way of doing things. The second way, adaptive competence, is just having a lot of people who are very situationally aware, who are aware at all times of things that are going on that might hurt them. And then they have the education and the skills, but also the processes and the systems within their organizations, within their place of work, to enable them to adapt very quickly to whatever the situation is. It turns out, as we've seen demonstrated at a global level, that the pre-planned stockpiling, the vast machinery of pre-planned stockpiling, the very machismo of it, in fact, is not very good. It's not very good, not simply because the plans are almost always wrong, because they do not predict the correct risk. They don't. In many ways, if the thing is an emergency, by definition, it's something we haven't planned for. Not only is the planning almost always wrong in that sense, but also because pre-planned stockpiling disincentivizes competence. It disincentivizes talent, in fact. Because if all the decisions have already been made, if all of the preparation has already happened, and all you really need is for somebody to follow instructions that have already been written out, then that is not a very appealing role or an appealing set of tasks to the vast majority of high-performing individuals. And indeed, all individuals of every level of talent will probably, in the moment, rebel against those plans simply as a matter of human nature. Having lots of stuff, and whether that stuff is physical stuff like warehouses full of things, or it's a more abstract type of stuff such as a huge sense of national exceptionalism, for example. Having enormous amounts of stuff and the resultant feeling of invincibility that you get from that stuff seems to be a classic resource curse. It actually leaves you more vulnerable to the unexpected. In other words, thinking you're special, thinking you've thought of everything already, having done your preparation and then stopped paying attention is a very bad idea. Simply evidence-based, you look around the world today and you look at the countries that are pre-planned stockpilers, and you'll see that the vast majority of them are in a very bad situation today. The US, the UK being particularly good examples of this. I'm British and American, and I speak to you here from my office in New York, where we are once again moving back up the curve, and New York is particularly well prepared compared to the rest of the states here in the States. But if you look at countries in East Asia, Japan, China, Taiwan as a very good example, their adaptive competence, their holistic situational awareness and their ability to change their plans and change their ways of being very, very quickly in an adaptive way to the situation at hand has left them in an extremely good situation. Very few cases indeed. And in some countries, China for example, right now at time of recording, they have no community spread of COVID, whereas here in the US and Western Europe, we have a considerable amount. But regardless, other than the pandemic, a lack of adaptive competence, a lack of continually reassessing the situation and applying intelligence to it, and the ability to change your plans in relation to that new information coming in, seems to be a hallmark of all of the major crises that are happening today. In less than 6 weeks or so, the UK is going to fall out of the transition period of Brexit, potentially without a trade deal, although of course that may happen between me recording this and you watching me. But that again seems to be a situation where a surplus of national exceptionalism and an inability to adapt at every single level, whether that's at governmental or at mere exporter and trade level, seems to be creating an enormous, if not existential, problem. Now, the difference between having stopped thinking and got on with preparation and having a preparation which consists of only thinking about things and then adapting accordingly, that tension between the two, I think, is made worse hugely by the second thing, the ontological crisis, especially the ontological crisis here in the West. It is impossible to plan for, to prepare for, to react to appropriately anything if you do not share a mental model with everybody else who is involved. The lack of a shared mental model, even if that shared mental model is the agreement that we have no mental model to go with in this particular situation, and therefore we are going to attempt to find one, the lack of a shared mental model produces utter chaos. You cannot have a reaction to anything if you don't agree what it is in reality. Now, there's always been, of course, a variance in the understanding of any event. There's always been a variance in the understanding of any future plans. But what we seem to be undergoing today, and especially, as I say, here in the West, is a fundamental crisis in people's common perception of the reality of the world. Objectively speaking, across the population, there is not an objective reality. For many reasons, very complex reasons, demographically significant proportions of the US population, the UK population, and many other populations across Europe, democratically significant proportions of those populations act, make decisions, plan, prepare, or fail to prepare, and operate in the world in general based on an understanding of the operations of the world which is completely divergent from base reality. Now, this isn't a matter of political disagreement. This is not hyperbole based on calling people who believe things on the other end of the political spectrum from you crazy, right? This isn't an aesthetic disagreement. This isn't a sort of something that end up with good-natured or bad-tempered arguments across the dinner table over at Christmas or Thanksgiving. This is very different. We have, and especially here in the US, a significant proportion of the general population, of the voting population, of the active adults in the world who raise families and run businesses and operate in the universe, whose understanding of the way the world works is fundamentally wrong. Not a matter of opinion, not a matter of relativism, but just not true. And this is a huge problem. It's a huge problem for today's biggest problem, the pandemic, because it's very, very difficult to have a planned, appropriate reaction to a pandemic if a significant proportion of your population do not believe in germ theory or basic science. But it also bodes extremely badly for the major problems that are coming down the line. Climate change, Brexit, all of the major political changes that are going to happen over the next 10, 15, 20 years are all reliant, the success or failure of those things are all reliant on at least some common understanding of what is actually happening. And it becomes incredibly difficult to have any conversation with anybody about a particular thing if they do not believe that particular thing is real, or if they believe that the truth behind a particular thing is something which is patently not real. The vast scale of this ontological crisis, the very fact that you can have major world leaders from multiple countries be able, without any personal shame or embarrassment, stand in front of their audiences and say things which are not just political untruths, but utterly devoid of any basis in reality statements, is a huge crisis and creates an entirely new context within which we will all have to operate in the world going forward. Because it doesn't actually matter whether we are holders of beliefs which are objectively true or holders of beliefs which are not. The fact that we operate within a world where there are significant proportions of people who believe something the other people find to be impossible, and not just politically unattractive or aesthetically unpleasing, but if they believe something that is actually impossible, then we have to reconsider almost all of the structures of our companies and our countries and our communities, because we will never be able to address those major problems that are most definitely coming down the line to us. There are too many aspects of the ontological crisis really to discuss, I think, in the time that we have. But I'd like to raise one of those, a major subset of it, which is called cognitive risk. I've done a considerable amount of work with my clients over the past few years in this area. And to summarize it, we can put it like this, that in every field, whether we're talking about finance or national security or cybersecurity or whatever it is, you are encouraged quite heavily to protect your assets. In a knowledge-based economy, in a highly digitized world, in a world where we think for a living, where we take in information, think about it, and then output something for other people to take that information on further. In a knowledge-based economy, our major assets, in fact our most important asset, is our ability to think clearly about the world as it is today. And cognitive risk is the risk and the groups of things that add to that risk that we will not be able to. All of the things that prevent us from thinking clearly about the world as it is today. And I'm very quickly going to go through the 4 aspects of this, because I think this is going to be a major part of your lives going forward. There are 4 aspects: bad inputs, bad mental models, bad environment, and bad outputs. Bad inputs is pretty obvious. It's all of the stuff that you take in, the news that you read, the sources for all of your information. If you're getting your information about the world from places which are making things up, then all of your thinking is going to be based on nonsense. And that's the case for news as much as it is the case for accounting, or understanding how your business is operating, or understanding your personal relationships even. You have to critically and consciously assess your inputs, making sure that the data that you're getting from them is true, and do everything you can to protect that. The second is bad mental models. And this is very similar, but basically the same. If you can get as much truth in, but if the way you interpret it, the way you think about things, if that's wrong, then the rest of your thinking is going to be wrong too. Mental models you get mostly from education, and wide education, and for some people you get a lot of it from therapy and other forms of self-development as well. Again, very well known to an educated audience such as yourself. The third one I think is more interesting, which is, in some ways, is much more interesting, which is actually the bad environment, the place in which you do your thinking. And here's where we can actually go back to the pandemic. The reason we can do that is because we know, through a good deal of science over the past few years, that the air quality, the quality of the air that you're breathing as you're doing your thinking, directly affects the quality of that thinking. If you have very high air pollution, particulates in the air, then you actually make more mistakes. You think less clearly. There have been some very good experiments. So there's long-term experiments with school children where they varied the air quality, usually by improving it, of course. Or more acute experiments, for example, a statistical one where they looked at real-time air quality data across cities in the United States, and they looked at the statistical modeling of the mistakes that Major League Baseball umpires were making in real time. And they found that the air quality on a minute-by-minute basis was directly related to the amount of mistakes that baseball umpires were making. The worse the air, the more mistakes the baseball umpires made. The evidence is very strong that the better the air, the cleverer you are, the worse the air, the less clever you are. And we are about to have a major natural experiment with this. Here in New York State, all public schools to reopen have to have HEPA filtered air conditioning and much better ventilation. Vastly improving, in fact, the air quality in those buildings compared to the air quality last year, and especially in the poorer areas of New York where the schools are closer to the freeways and the higher polluting industries. I predict very strongly that in a few years' time we will look at those grades, the grade levels that are achieved in those schools, and controlling for everything else, we will have a considerably more intelligent student body, simply because of the environment they find themselves in. And lastly, bad outputs. If you can do the cleverest thinking you like, but if you are restricted to outputting the results in a Word document, a spreadsheet, or a PowerPoint deck, and that's all you can use, the quality of your expression of that idea will suffer. And so moving forward, I believe that we will be looking at a good deal of new technologies to enable us to explain and discuss much more abstract and much more complex ideas that you can easily explain or discuss in an A4 sheet of paper or a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint deck. Now, all of that stuff about cognitive risk, again, we can talk about more offline, but I'd like to finish now by talking to you about the Great Reassessment, the final of the three. Before the pandemic, we thought digitization and the rush into the internet age would take the remaining corporations and the larger organizations and governments around the world at least another 5 to 10 years to get on top of. For most of the major organizations, especially here in New York, that process happened actually in about 5 days, around about March the 13th. When everybody was sent home and the lockdown happens and everybody was forced to work remotely, organizations of every level, of every size, were forced into the digital era extremely suddenly. The first thing you had to do was you had to convert the processes that you relied on that previously happened in person, you had to convert them into digital processes. And that was a scramble. But when you did that, you were encouraged in many ways to reassess what processes you had, because every additional process that you had to convert into code or into a digital thing would take more time and more effort, and so many companies reassessed the way they worked at that point. A few months on, and being fully digital, again, many organizations looked at the way they were working and said, well, if we're going to be working digitally, we can bring in all of these new technologies, we can use these new tools and techniques, we can try all of the cool toys. And again, they reassessed the way they were working. And in my experience with my clients over the past few months, the very biggest ones have all, without exception, made the declaration to themselves, if not publicly, that they are never going to go back to the office. And they have reassessed literally everything about the way that they work. And this is leading their employees to do the same. If they're going to be working remotely forever, does it matter where they live? If they're going to be working remotely, they're only going to be supervised remotely, which means that chances are they will be supervised based on what they achieve and not how they achieve it, or how often they're sat down at their desk whilst they're achieving it. And this means in those high-performing organizations, those individuals, some of them will decide that they're only going to work 4 days a week and they'll get all of their stuff done in those 4 days. Or some people will decide to only work at nights or only early in the mornings, or some people will go and work on the beach with their laptop. And all of the things that prevented us from doing that before, all of the inertia, all of the habits, all of the social mores that prevented us from doing that before, they have all gone away. What COVID has done is it has called everything into question. It has exposed to us the need to be adaptive and to be competent. And it has shown us that the only people who will be able to do anything effectively are the people who have a grasp on objective reality and who protect the way that they can think, where they're thinking, and how they're expressing their ideas. With all of these changes together and all of the big problems coming down the line, I think that the next few years are going to be, in many ways, tremendously exciting. We have never before been shown the serious faults. We've never before been shown the stakes that we face. And we've never also before been shown how possible it is to be successful at it. And so with those things, I'd like to thank you and wish you all good luck, and hopefully we'll meet in person next year.